Studies Section 7, Nigeria's Foreign Policy, January 1966 to 1975. Introduction. In this study session, we shall focus on the conduct of Nigeria's foreign policy during the brief regime of Ironsi and regime of General Yakubu Gowon. We shall examine the features, challenges, and achievements of this administration in the conduct of Nigeria's foreign policy. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study section, you should be able to 1. Discuss the change in orientation of Nigeria's foreign policy under General Yakubu Gowon. 2. Highlight the achievements of the regime in the administration of Nigeria's foreign policy. 3. Point out achievements recorded by the regime in Nigeria's foreign policy administration. Features of Nigeria's foreign policy under General Yakubu Gowon. The need to reinvigorate Nigeria's external relations had arisen before the coup that swept away the Balewa administration. However, as Ofoegbu 1979 observed, the 6-month regime of Ironsi illustrates the fact that no state internally disturbed and unstable can be effective in international relations. Thus, domestic problems did not allow the Ironsi regime to articulate and pursue any serious foreign policy other than to maintain policies inherited from Balewa. In the area of orientation or policy-making/implementation, the regime did not leave any imprint on Nigeria's foreign policy. Nevertheless, the regime stopped the practice of sending regional economic missions overseas and closed down regional consulates abroad. By the time the regime was overthrown on 29 July 1968, there was nothing of note with which it could be identified in the area of foreign policy. This was perhaps due to the pressures of domestic politics which the regime had to contend with. The counter-coup that occurred 29 July 1966 ushered in the Gowon regime. The regime of Yakubu Gowon inherited a country on the verge of disintegration. It was therefore not surprising that the regime spent its first year in office on efforts to save Nigeria from disintegrating. In the face of numerous internal problems, Nigeria's foreign policy operated at the level of routine observation of commitment and relations inherited from Ironsi and Balewa. The new regime hardly the time to articulate any coherent foreign policy before it was engulfed in a civil war that took it 3 years to quell. The need to quell the civil war was more pressing. Civil war and the shift in foreign relations. When the civil war broke out in July 1967, the focus, orientation, and method of foreign policy assumed a new character and quality. The foreign policy machinery was fully stretched by the task of managing the multitude of problems and issues engendered by the civil war. Lessons of the civil war reorientated Nigeria's foreign policy. Nigeria had to contend with the initial hostility of France, the treasury of Israel, which gave surreptitious support to Biafra, and of African states such as Gabon, Cote d'Ivoire, Tanzania, and Zambia, which granted diplomatic recognition to Biafra. Also, she had to contend with the indifference of her neighbors, America's neutrality, and the initial vacillation by Britain, Nigeria's traditional arms supplier, over supplying badly needed offensive weapons, an action which shocked the foundations of Anglo-Nigerian relations and also jeopardized Nigerians' confidence in the West. The fact that Britain and other Western allies watched the war at a distance without giving any unequivocal support to the federal government taught Nigeria a crucial lesson that she needed to diversify her external relations, having learned in the hard way that there is no permanent friend in international politics but permanent interest. The war led to the most interesting development of the war years. This was in the area of Nigeria's foreign policy orientation. The Commonwealth was removed from the dominating position it had occupied in Nigerian foreign policy between 1960 and 1967 and replaced by a new emphasis on Africa and a more realistic posture towards Russia and Eastern Europe. Trade followed weapons and socialist ideas were allowed into the country. General Yakubu Gowon paid state visit to the Soviet Union and China, the first Nigerian leader to do so. This did not, however, jeopardize Nigeria's relations with the Anglo-American bloc. The government also downplayed the relevance of the Commonwealth in its foreign relations. The detent of the late 1960s and the early 1970s helped Nigeria to leverage and diversify her foreign relations. Thus, the foundation for positive non-alignment was laid. After the war, Nigeria moved back into the center stage of African international and world politics. It normalized relations with those countries, which gave diplomatic recognition to Biafra and gradually strengthened bilateral relations with our neighbors and other African states. Nigeria became progressively vocal on issues affecting Africa in general, on problems of decolonization and apartheid in particular. On the issue of apartheid in South Africa, Nigeria under Gowon moved away from dialogue to full support for armed liberation, probably because of South African support for Biafra and alleged roles of South African mercenaries in Biafra's army during the Civil War. Nigeria also explored a newfound oil power to prosecute our regional and African policy. The emergence of oil as a major weapon of foreign policy injected more dynamism into Nigeria's foreign relations and made it possible for a more adventurous conduct of foreign policy. Nigeria became a major oil-producing country and was infused by petrodollar and an abundance of wealth and capability to be a major actor in international and African politics. As Nigeria's economic prosperity, based on the fortunes of crude oil, began to increase, Nigeria sought to assert itself economically and to consolidate African economic cooperation. Towards this end, General Gowon embarked on extensive official trips abroad, and his administration provided generous material and humanitarian support for the nationalist struggles in Africa. Nigeria also offered financial aid to drought-affected countries in Africa, gave grants to some countries at their independence and to other countries for various reasons, and sold oil at concessionary prices to some West African states. It even decided to forego its right to benefit from the financial operations of the African Development Bank (ADB) in favor of more needy African states, and established a Nigerian trust fund of $80 million with the ADFB for loans on easy terms to African countries. This reflects an element of Nigeria's elite culture. In other words, Nigeria's foreign policy and the Nigerian state itself were not seen as instruments of pursuing economic interest to improve the lot of the Nigerian populace. The oil boom of the early 1970s afforded the Gowon regime more room to establish the country as a strong international actor. The oil boom increased Nigeria's dependence on a few expatriates managing the oil resource. It also created what was earlier referred to as contract mania, with many foreign companies benefiting. Achievements of the era: the institution of constructive non-alignment in Nigeria's foreign policy and the establishment of ECOWAS were major achievements of Nigeria's diplomacy at this period. Nigeria took action after the Civil War vis-à-vis the West African sub-region, and consequently the creation of ECOWAS in 1975 on account of the following: the impact of the Civil War, the realization that Nigeria was not secure as it assumed, the role of France on the side of the secessionist forces, and French initiative after the Civil War to create in the sub-region an exclusively Francophone economic community. Challenges of the era: generally, not much changed contrary to wide expectation in Nigeria's foreign relations under the Gowon regime due to a number of reasons. The lack of a firm center, combined with the abundance of resources, created an environment suggestive of an inactive bureaucracy. The Nigerian power elite remained the same, and despite the indigenization policy meant to transfer ownership of capital to them, they remained essentially comprador and agents of international capital. Nigeria's extreme dependence on oil revenue and the nature of the international oil market, which made the US the largest market for Nigeria's oil. The fragile nature of internal cohesion of the Nigerian state and the desire not to create a situation that would demand concrete military commitment too soon after the Civil War. The Nigerian diplomatic style under Gowon thus lacked vitality and action. It failed to respond correctly to the needs of Africa and could not offer leadership in action and thought which Nigeria's human and material endowment demanded. The Gowon regime failed to take any stand that showed that the country was trying to assert leadership in Africa. Study section summary. In this study session, we examine the preoccupation of the Gowon administration was how to handle the Nigerian Civil War, which started in 1976. The impact of the Civil War reorientated Nigeria's foreign policy. Failure of Nigeria's traditional friends to come to the aid of country in the head of war made the country to redefine her foreign policy and relax her unfriendly stance towards the Eastern Bloc. However, Nigeria continued to be pro-West in her economic relations, increased relations with fellow members of the OAU, and also continued to employ quiet diplomacy. Though the establishment of ECOWAS was the major achievement of Nigeria's diplomacy at this period, the Nigerian diplomatic style still lacked dynamism and action. This is the end of study section 7. Thanks for listening.